The cameras clicked on, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes. The studio buzzed with the low hum of whispered conversations, shuffling papers, and the faint thud of producers giving signals just out of sight. The evening's program had promised a heated discussion, but nobody in the audience could have predicted just how explosive it would become. At the center of it all sat J.D. Vance, calm and collected, dressed in a sharp suit that reflected none of the nerves people might have expected from someone about to be grilled on live television. His posture was steady, leaning slightly forward, hands resting on the arms of his chair. He looked not like a man about to defend himself but like someone waiting patiently for a test he already knew the answers to. Across from him, the journalist prepared his notes. He was well known in the industry, a veteran anchor whose reputation rested on his ability to rattle even the most seasoned guests. His style wasn't one of fair questioning, it was interrogation, coated in sarcasm and delivered with a smirk. He leaned forward on the desk, pen in hand, lips already twitching with a smug half-smile. The first few questions had been standard enough, about policy proposals, the economy, and foreign affairs. Vance answered steadily, giving the kind of responses that politicians usually offer, though with a tone sharper than most, clear, confident, and unapologetic. But the journalist had been circling, waiting for the moment to strike. Finally, he leaned in, dropping his voice into a cutting tone. "Senator Vance," he said, dragging out the name like it was a challenge, "don't you think your positions are outdated? Honestly, don't you believe the American people deserve someone more in touch with reality, instead of someone clinging to rhetoric that belongs to another era?" The jab landed. A murmur ran through the studio audience, a wave of whispers and faint laughter. The phrasing wasn't a question, it was an accusation, an insult thinly disguised as inquiry. The journalist sat back with a satisfied gleam in his eyes, expecting Vance to stumble, to fumble over words or rush into a defensive posture. But Vance didn't move, his eyes fixed on the journalist, unblinking, calm, almost amused. He let the silence stretch, a silence so sharp it made the journalist shift slightly in his chair. The audience leaned forward, sensing something about to break. Then, with measured control, Vance spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried with a weight that silenced even the faintest whisper in the room. "You call it outdated. I call it common sense." The journalist's smile flickered. Vance pressed on, his tone sharpening like a blade. "The problem with people in your position is that you mistake arrogance for intelligence. You think mocking the values of ordinary Americans makes you superior. But what it really does is reveal just how out of touch the media has become with the struggles of everyday life." The audience broke into scattered applause, but Vance wasn't finished. He leaned slightly forward, his words now aimed like arrows. "You sit here, in your studio, surrounded by lights and cameras, convinced that your view of reality is the only one that matters. You mock traditions, faith, and the dignity of work because you don't understand them. You look down on the people who built this country, who still keep it running every single day, and then you wonder why they no longer trust you." The journalist tried to interject, but Vance raised a hand, calm but firm. The interruption died instantly. "The reality my constituents live in," Vance continued, his voice ringing with conviction, "is not the one you write about in polished columns or debate in cocktail parties. It's a reality where families struggle to pay bills, where parents work 2 jobs to provide for their children, where people still believe in the value of hard work, faith, and community. And they don't need lectures from someone who's never lived a day in their shoes. They need leaders who respect them, who fight for them, not journalists who belittle them." By now, the studio had erupted in applause. The audience wasn't just clapping politely, they were cheering, clapping harder, some even rising to their feet. The journalist, caught mid-expression, sat frozen, his pen limp in his hand, the smug confidence wiped clean from his face. The cameras captured every moment. The anchor's silence, his failed attempt to cut Vance off, and the look in his eyes as he realized he had just been dismantled on his own stage. The power dynamic had shifted completely. For Vance, it wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about something larger. Turning the mirror back on the media, exposing its condescension, and showing the audience, both in the studio and watching at home, that he would not be cowed by smug questions or loaded accusations. And in that moment, as the applause thundered and the journalist sat speechless, J.D. Vance had not only silenced his critic, he had made a statement that echoed far beyond the walls of that studio. The applause inside the studio seemed to last longer than anyone expected. It wasn't the kind of polite clapping that usually followed a political exchange, it was raw, charged, and thunderous. Some members of the audience were standing now, their cheers rising above the sound of hands colliding. Others just sat stunned, eyes wide, mouths half open, as if they had just witnessed something far more consequential than a television interview. The journalist, who had made a career out of controlling the narrative, sat stiffly in his chair, lips pressed tightly together, trying to recover his composure. But the cameras caught everything: the falter in his expression, the way his jaw twitched, the sudden discomfort in his eyes. It was rare to see him on the defensive, and the moment was already slipping away from him. The producers behind the glass scrambled, gesturing frantically at each other. They had expected fireworks, yes, but not like this. Not with their own anchor left speechless and the guest controlling the entire tempo of the segment. They whispered about whether to cut to commercial, but it was too late. The audience was on fire, and the story had already written itself. Vance sat calmly, almost motionless in his chair, letting the roar of applause wash over him. He didn't raise his hands, didn't gloat, didn't even smile. Instead, he waited, his silence communicating that he had said what needed to be said. That composure, more than the words themselves, made the moment land with even greater weight. When the applause finally began to die down, the journalist attempted a weak pivot. His voice cracked slightly as he tried to move to the next topic, but the authority in his tone was gone. The sting, the sharpness, the condescension, none of it remained. Every word that followed sounded hollow, overshadowed by the exchange that had just taken place. The interview limped to its conclusion, but no one in the audience was paying attention anymore. Their minds were still replaying the confrontation, the silence before Vance's answer, and the unshakable confidence in his reply. When the show finally wrapped and the cameras powered down, the studio buzzed with an energy that felt almost electric. Producers rushed past, staff whispered to each other, and audience members grabbed their phones. Clips were already being recorded from the live broadcast, trimmed, and uploaded to social media before Vance had even left the building. By the time he stepped into the crisp night air outside the studio, the internet was already alive with reactions. On Twitter, hashtags bearing his name began trending within minutes. On TikTok, the clip of him saying, "You call it outdated. I call it common sense," was being replayed, set to dramatic background music, and shared thousands of times over. Commentators, influencers, and ordinary citizens alike were weighing in. Some hailed the moment as a much-needed smackdown against media arrogance. Others tried to defend the journalist, but their voices were drowned in the tide of viewers who had been waiting for someone, anyone, to speak directly to what they felt had been ignored for too long. Within hours, news outlets scrambled to cover the fallout. Headlines splashed across websites. J.D. Vance silences host in fiery exchange, journalist left speechless after senator's sharp reply, studio audience erupts as Vance defends everyday Americans. Cable news networks played the clip on repeat. Some praised Vance's composure, noting how rare it was for a guest to seize control of an interview. Others criticized him, claiming he had been disrespectful, but even their coverage inadvertently spread the moment further. Every replay, every headline, every angry op-ed only made the clip more visible. Back in Ohio, in diners, barbershops, and family living rooms, people who had never watched the program live were watching it now on their phones. Many nodded in agreement, some clapped even though they were alone. For them, it wasn't just about politics, it was about finally seeing someone stand up, without hesitation, to the sneering tone they had grown used to from the media. The journalist, meanwhile, avoided comment. His colleagues defended him, but privately, even they admitted he had been caught flat-footed. His silence during the exchange had become the symbol of the entire moment, a silence that echoed louder than any rebuttal he could have offered. For Vance, the victory was less about headlines and more about momentum. He hadn't just won an argument, he had tapped into a sentiment that ran deeper than party lines. The people who watched that clip didn't just see a politician, they saw someone who refused to be humiliated, someone who carried their frustrations into the heart of a studio and fired them back at the very people they blamed for being out of touch. The days that followed only amplified the moment. Town halls where Vance appeared were filled with voters bringing up the clip, shaking his hand, and thanking him for saying what we're all thinking. At rallies, chants broke out, "Common sense. Common sense," a direct echo of the words he had delivered under the hot glare of studio lights. Even those who disagreed with his policies couldn't deny the impact of the moment. In an era where politicians often danced around hard questions, afraid of saying the wrong thing, Vance had gone the other way. He had leaned into the question, stripped away the condescension, and delivered a response that made even his critics pause. The journalist had wanted to corner him, to expose weakness, to reduce him to a defensive figure. Instead, he had provided the stage for one of the most defining moments of Vance's public career. And in doing so, he had inadvertently silenced himself, leaving not just the studio speechless, but a nation talking.